makes sense to care about how people see you. That is not vanity. That is what thoughtful, socially aware people do. You monitor yourself. You consider how your words land. You adjust. You edit before you speak, soften before you send, calibrate before you walk into a room. And most people would say that is emotional intelligence, not a problem to be fixed. Carl Jung had a different name for it, and a different verdict. There are 4 layers here. The last one is the one nobody wants to say out loud, because it means the thing you have been calling consideration is actually costing you something you cannot get back by being more considerate. It means the exhaustion is not incidental. It is structural, and it means that the energy you have been giving every single day to managing what everyone else thinks of you, that energy was supposed to be building something else entirely. Before we go further, if this kind of content lands for you, the kind that peels something back instead of just explaining it, the subscribe button is how you tell the algorithm you want more of it. YouTube only keeps showing you what it thinks you asked for, and what is coming next in these layers is worth asking for. The deeper we go, the more uncomfortable it gets. That is not a warning. That is a promise. The first layer goes down fast. The second one is where it starts to sting. The third one is where the floor moves. Let me start where everyone starts. You learned early that other people have feelings, that your actions affect them, that a certain kind of person pays attention to that, and a certain kind does not. You decided at some point that you were the kind who does, and you were right. Caring about impact is not the issue, but here is what happened on the way from caring about impact to where you are now. At some point, and most people cannot name exactly when, caring about impact became managing impact. You stopped asking what is honest and started asking what will land well. You stopped tracking your own internal state and started tracking theirs. You became very good at reading the room. So good, in fact, that you forgot you were in it. Somewhere in that drift, the monitoring stopped being a choice you made consciously and became the background operating system of your social life. You do not decide to monitor anymore. It happens automatically. The half-second pause before you say what you actually think. The mental edit that runs before the words leave your mouth. The version of the message you send after the 3 drafts you did not send. This is what the management looks like from the inside. Fast, invisible, continuous. That is the surface. That is what everyone sees and calls being considerate. But look a little closer. In 1974, a social psychologist named Mark Snyder published research on what he called self-monitoring, the degree to which a person regulates their own behavior based on how they think others are perceiving them. He built a scale. He studied hundreds of people. He found that high self-monitors were socially impressive. They read social cues brilliantly. They adjusted seamlessly. They were, by every external measure, adept. People liked them. Rooms ran more smoothly when they were in them. They never said the wrong thing at the wrong moment because they were always aware of what the wrong thing would be. He also found something else, something that did not make it into the popular summary of the research, something that got left out of the way it was taught in introductory psychology courses, probably because it is uncomfortable to say in a culture that rewards social fluency. High self-monitoring requires massive, continuous cognitive effort, not occasional effort. Constant. The person who is always reading the room is running a process in the background. Every single conversation, every single interaction, every single room they walk into. That process is monitoring for signals, processing those signals, generating an adjusted response, suppressing the unfiltered response, and presenting the calibrated version. All of this happening faster than conscious thought. All of this consuming energy that comes from somewhere. Snyder called it the psychological cost of inauthenticity. In plain terms, the better you are at managing what others think of you, the more of your cognitive and emotional energy that management is consuming. All the time, even when you are not aware of it. This is why you are tired, not because you worked hard today, not because you stayed up too late or took on too much. You are tired because you have been running a background program for years, possibly for most of your adult life, possibly for most of your life, that monitors, adjusts, compensates, softens, sharpens, and recalibrates your presentation to the world. That program never switches off. It runs at dinner, in text messages, in the way you phrase an email 3 different times before sending it, in the half-second pause before you say what you actually think, in the moment at the end of the day when you replay conversations and wonder if you said the wrong thing. The exhaustion is structural. It is built into the system you are running. And the system was not designed to rest. But wait, that is only the first layer. And the first layer is the palatable one. The one where the problem is cognitive load, and we nod along and feel mildly validated. The second layer is where the frame changes completely. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. Jung described the persona as a mask, and people hear that word and think he meant it critically, as if wearing a mask is pathological or dishonest. He did not mean that. A persona, in the theatrical sense, was the mask a Greek actor wore to project a character to the audience. Jung borrowed the word precisely because he was precise. The persona is a necessary structure. Every human being develops one. It is how you navigate social life without constant, exhausting negotiation of who you are in every moment. You present a version of yourself appropriate to context. You behave differently at a job interview than at your kitchen table. That is not deception. That is basic, healthy social functioning. The problem, Jung said, and here is where the clinical language starts to have weight, is what happens when the mask fuses with the face, when you can no longer tell the difference between the performance and the person, when the persona, the mask built to make the right impression on others, to fit the social role, to be acceptable, becomes so central to your sense of identity that your actual self becomes peripheral. When you have been managing your image for so long that you have lost track of what you were before the management started. When someone asks you what you actually want, and the honest answer is that you do not entirely know, because you have spent so long producing what is wanted of you that the practice of knowing what you want has quietly atrophied. Jung wrote about this in his 2 essays on analytical psychology, published in 1928. He described the persona as a system of relations, not just a single mask, but a complicated network of adjustments between the inner person and the outer social world. He observed it in patients, in colleagues, in historical figures, and he warned, with the precision of someone who had watched it destroy people, that identification with the persona leads to a peculiar kind of emptiness. Not depression, exactly. Not anxiety, exactly. Something more unsettling than either. A person who functions perfectly well, but has no idea who they actually are when the functioning stops. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A person who functions perfectly well, but has no idea who they actually are. Does that describe you, even partially? Even in moments, Sunday afternoons when there is nothing required of you, no one to manage, no performance to maintain, and the stillness feels less like rest than like a room where something is missing. Because here is what Jung was saying underneath the clinical language. You can be extremely successful at being a persona. Well-liked, socially skilled, reliable, never the one who makes things uncomfortable, and simultaneously be someone who has never actually met themselves. The persona is so convincing to others that it eventually becomes convincing to you. You stop questioning it. You stop noticing the gap between what you present and what you feel. And one day you realize, with a particular kind of cold dread, that you have been performing a self for so long that you are not entirely sure what the self underneath was supposed to be. The persona did not lie to everyone else. It lied to you. And it did it so gradually, so smoothly, that you did not notice when it crossed the line from useful adaptation to total occupation. A clinical psychologist named Donald Winnicott arrived at the same territory from a completely different direction. Winnicott was studying infants and children. He was trying to understand what happens when a child does not receive what he called good enough parenting, when the environment around them is inconsistent, demanding, emotionally unpredictable, or contingent. Contingent means The love and acceptance the child receives depends on a condition, on being a certain way, on not being too loud, too needy, too angry, too much, on producing the version of themselves that the environment will tolerate. What Winnicott found was that children in those circumstances develop an adaptive strategy that is, in every sense of the word, brilliant. They construct what he called a false self, a version of themselves that reads the environment with extraordinary sensitivity, with the acute attunement that only develops when the stakes are survival level, and responds to what the environment requires. Not what the child actually needs, not what the child actually feels, what the environment requires, and they present that instead of the authentic self in order to survive the relationship. Winnicott published this in 1960. He described the false self as a brilliant survival strategy. He was careful to use that word, survival, because he wanted to be clear. This was not a failure. It was not pathological in origin. It was adaptive, necessary, clever. The false self does not lie, exactly. It just never says what might not be wanted. It performs acceptability, because in the original environment, acceptability was the condition for being kept. Winnicott's true self, the vulnerable one the false self was built to protect, does not disappear. It goes into hiding. It waits. It maintains a kind of underground existence, occasionally surfacing in moments of solitude or creativity or deep intimacy, before retreating again when the social environment signals that it needs the performance. Jung's persona and Winnicott's false self are not identical concepts. They come from different traditions, different clinical observations, different theoretical frameworks, but they describe the same movement, the same drift. The self, retreating inward for protection and leaving a constructed, socially acceptable version in its place. One philosopher of the psyche and one developmental pediatrician, decades apart, arriving at the same finding by different routes. When two independent observers from different fields identify the same structure, it is worth paying attention. And here is the part nobody says. That construction does not end when childhood ends. If you learned early enough that the safest version of you is the one that monitors and adjusts, that version becomes automatic. It becomes the default. The false self and the persona fuse into a single, seamless operating system that runs at a level below conscious decision. You carry it into every relationship, every workplace, every family dinner, every moment where your authentic response and the socially expected response diverge. And in each of those moments, the system runs faster than your awareness of it and chooses the expected one. Not because you are weak, not because you are especially damaged, because that is what the program does. It was built for speed and invisibility. It runs fast, it runs quietly, and it runs every single time. This is layer 3. And this is where the frame does not just shift, it inverts. Go back to the beginning for a moment, back to that first sentence. It makes sense to care about how people see you. Thoughtful, socially aware people do. Now look at it again with everything you know from the second layer. What you were calling thoughtfulness, what felt like consideration, emotional intelligence, social awareness, was, in many cases, the false self running its protocol. The self-monitoring was not primarily generosity. It was, in Winnicott's exact phrasing, a survival strategy, developed before you had the cognitive capacity to decide whether it was serving you, installed at a level below conscious choice, during years when the stakes felt absolute, even if they were not. And here is the specific thing nobody wants to hear. That strategy has been running, largely unchanged, in contexts where the original survival pressure no longer exists. The people who required the performance, the environment that made acceptability feel conditional on the performance, those people may no longer be in your life. Or they may still be present, but no longer have the power they once had. Or the conditional acceptance may have been internalized so thoroughly that the original source no longer needs to be there for the program to keep running. The threat is mostly gone. The program does not know that. It watches every room for the signals that once meant danger, the slight shift in someone's expression, the silence where approval was expected, the possibility of having said the wrong thing, and it runs its adjustments accordingly, whether or not the danger is present. It is not irrational exactly. It is running from accurate historical data. It is just running it in a context where the data no longer applies. You are exhausted by a system that is protecting you from a threat that is largely no longer there. And this is the genuinely uncomfortable part. Understanding this does not automatically stop it. You can read everything I just said about Snyder's cognitive cost, about Jung's fused persona, about Winnicott's false self, and still walk into a room 10 minutes from now and start monitoring. Still soften something you did not want to soften. Still rephrase the thing you actually thought. Still pause before you say the honest thing and edit it into the acceptable thing. Because the system is not in the part of you that reads and thinks and understands. It is in the part that acts before you decide. This is what makes individuation, Jung's term for the process of becoming more genuinely yourself, harder than it sounds in a summary. It is not a decision. It is not even primarily an insight. It is an orientation, a slow, continuous practice of noticing the moment when the persona is about to speak and pausing long enough to ask whether you actually agree with what it is about to say. Harriet Braiker, who spent decades working clinically with chronic people pleasers, used language that was deliberately jarring. She called it the disease to please, not a character flaw, not a social style, not a preference for harmony. A disease, not metaphorically. She meant something measurable and progressive, something that, over time, does documented damage, not only psychological, physical. The sustained suppression of authentic self-expression and authentic need registers in the body as chronic stress. Not the dramatic, obvious kind that you recognize and respond to, the quiet kind. The kind that runs underneath everything, that does not spike and resolve, but simply depletes, continuously over months and years. And sometimes the body gets more specific than general depletion. Natalie Liu was a coach and a writer, and by any external measure, she was very good at being acceptable. She had spent most of her adult life managing what others thought of her, performing the version of herself that kept people comfortable, kept the peace, maintained the image. She described herself as a chronic people pleaser, and she said it the way people say it when it still feels manageable, almost charming, like a personality quirk rather than a structural problem. Then she became seriously ill. Not the kind of ill that rest resolves. She developed sarcoidosis, a systemic autoimmune condition that is poorly understood, difficult to treat, and capable of affecting multiple organ systems. At its worst, it threatened her vision. She saw multiple specialists. There was no single identifiable cause. Natalie, writing later about the experience, came to understand it in terms that her doctors had not offered. Her body had been carrying the weight of constant performance, the vigilance, the self-suppression, the relentless management of others' perceptions. And it had, at some level, stopped cooperating. The immune system, designed to protect, had turned. She described her eventual decision to stop performing the good girl, to stop managing everyone else's image of her, to start saying no as a primary response rather than a last resort. Not as a psychological breakthrough, but as a physical act of self-preservation. The most radical thing she had ever done, she said, was the thing that most people would describe as basic self-respect. That is not a metaphor or an anecdote told to illustrate a point. That is a case, a documented experience of a real person in which the cost of sustained performance registered in the body as something the body eventually refused to sustain. The cost of managing what everyone thinks of you is not always visible. It does not always announce itself as the cost of that specific thing. Sometimes it lives in the chronic fatigue that does not resolve with sleep. Sometimes in the low-frequency anxiety that follows you into rooms where there is no obvious reason for it. Sometimes in the specific grief of sitting down in a quiet moment and realizing that you do not know what you actually want to do. Not what would be practical, not what would look appropriate, not what would make the people around you comfortable, but what you actually want. And sometimes it shows up in a body that has been carrying a performance for so long that it develops its own response to the weight. The system has a cost. The cost is real. And the cost is charged in the currency of whatever energy you had available for building something of your own. Redirect this, not as a philosophical position, not as a lifestyle change that requires announcing, as a quiet, continuous act of reclamation. Here is what Jung was pointing toward, underneath the word individuation, and what Winnicott was pointing toward, underneath the words true self and false self. There is a version of you that predates the performance. That existed before you became skilled at reading the room. That had preferences and responses and a particular way of experiencing the world before those things were edited for acceptability. That self did not vanish when the false self was constructed. It did not dissolve when the persona solidified. It went quiet. It went underground. It waited. And it is still there, accessible, patient, not requiring a dramatic event to resurface, only requiring your attention to be turned back toward it. Focusing on yourself, genuinely, consistently, without performing the apology for it, is not selfishness. And here is why that matters. The accusation of selfishness is the most reliable tool the performance system uses to prevent you from stopping. The moment you suggest redirecting attention inward, the system generates the fear that doing so makes you narcissistic, indifferent, the kind of person who stopped caring. This is not an accident. That fear is part of the architecture. It is the lock on the door. Selfishness, properly defined, is taking from others at their expense, prioritizing your needs by harming theirs. What I am describing is different in kind. It is redirecting attention that was not truly theirs in the first place. The energy you spent monitoring their reactions to you. The cognitive bandwidth you used building and maintaining a version of yourself that would be acceptable to them. The genuine relational energy you would have available if it were not already consumed by the management of the performance. That energy was never rightfully theirs. You gave it because the system learned that giving it was necessary for belonging. But belonging that requires you to be continuously performing is not belonging. It is a sustained audition. Taking your energy back is not abandoning the people who matter to you. This is the piece that the dosi asked to be said clearly, because this is where the misread happens. Jung was not advocating for isolation. Individuation does not produce hermits or people who stop being capable of care. It produces people who can be genuinely present in relationships because they are no longer performing in them. There is a critical difference between connection and management. One is showing up as yourself and being met. The other is constructing a version of yourself, sending it in, and waiting to see if the construction is approved. The exhausted person who monitors everything, adjusts everything, softens everything, and edits everything before it leaves their mouth, that person is not fully present in their relationships. They are managing their relationships from behind the performance. And the people in your life who genuinely matter to you do not need the managed version. They need you, the actual you, the one that has been behind the persona for however many years the persona has been running. Dropping the performance is not abandonment. It is the thing that makes arrival possible. And this is what individuation actually looks like in practice. Not as a dramatic confrontation with the self, not as an announcement, not as a sudden refusal to care about anyone else, but as a series of small, deliberate redirections. Noticing in a conversation that you are about to soften something you did not actually want to soften, and pausing before doing it. Sending the email that says the honest thing on the first draft instead of the third. Sitting with the brief discomfort of someone being briefly disappointed by your authentic response instead of immediately performing your way back to their approval. Asking, at the end of a day, not how everyone else experienced you, but what you actually experienced. These are small acts. They do not look heroic from the outside. They look like someone slightly more themselves than they were yesterday. but accumulated over time, they are the architecture of something genuine, a self that was not built for others to approve of, but that actually belongs to you. I want to tell you something about this from my own experience. I spent over 30 years as an illustrator, commissions, editorial work, book covers, portraits, decades of reading what a client needed and producing it. I was skilled at it. I understood how to see through someone else's eyes and render what they were looking for. I thought that was the craft, the ability to be responsive to someone else's vision. It was only when the commission stopped, when I was retired and sitting in my studio in Lincoln with no brief, no client, no one waiting for a delivery, that I realized something I had managed not to notice for 3 decades. I had spent all of those years being extraordinarily responsive to other people's visions of what the image should be. And I had almost no developed practice of knowing what I myself wanted to draw. Not what would be technically impressive, not what would be marketable, not what would satisfy a client, but what I actually wanted to draw when nothing was required of me. I sat in front of a blank sheet of paper and I did not know. That was not a crisis of skill. That was a crisis of self. I found Jung the way I find most things, through the image, through the Red Book with its extraordinary interior illustrations, through his visual diagrams of the unconscious, the mandalas, the drawings he made not for publication but for himself. And what stopped me was not the theory, it was the recognition. The sense that someone had described, with clinical precision, the interior experience of a person who had spent a long time being very good at being what was needed and who had, in the process, lost contact with what they themselves needed. Jung called the work of recovering that lost contact individuation. He did not make it sound easy. He made it sound like the most important work a person could undertake, and also the most unsentimental. Not a journey toward some ideal version of yourself, a journey toward the actual one. The one that existed before it was shaped to fit what the environment required. Here is what stays with me from all of it. You are not tired because life is hard. You are tired because you have been living in someone else's idea of who you should be, and the rent on that particular address is paid in the energy that should be rebuilding your own interior. There is no gesture that resolves this overnight, no single decision that removes the persona and reveals the person, but there is a direction, and the direction is inward, not outward, toward the voice that speaks before the monitoring starts, toward the preferences and responses and needs that existed before they were edited for social consumption, toward the self that has been waiting without urgency, without resentment, for your attention to turn. That direction is what Jung called the path, not a destination. A direction. The false self was not your enemy. It was your strategy. It protected something real during years when that protection was necessary. The task now is not to condemn it, but to recognize it for what it was, and to recognize that the need it was built to meet has mostly passed. Winnicott said the true self could only emerge in an environment of safety. For most people who built the false self early, that environment was not available for a long time. But the practice of individuation, of small daily redirections of attention back toward yourself, begins to create that environment internally. You become, slowly, the safe environment your own self was waiting for. This video took real time and research to build. Finding the right sources, building the right layers, getting the Snyder research, the Winnicott framework, the Braiker clinical work, the Natalie Liu case into a shape that actually moves rather than simply explains. If it gave you something, if a layer landed in a way that shifted something, a super thanks is the most direct signal you can send that this kind of depth is worth building more of. It keeps the channel making this instead of simpler things. If that matters to you, thank you, genuinely. Now, the last layer, the one that closes the loop we opened at the beginning. Go back to that first sentence. It makes sense to care about how people see you. That is what thoughtful, socially aware people do. That is still true. Thoughtful people do care. But look at what we know now about the difference between caring and managing. Caring means being willing to be honest with someone even when it is uncomfortable. Caring means showing up as yourself and trusting that the relationship is strong enough to hold something real. Caring means that when someone is disappointed by your authentic response, you sit with them in that disappointment rather than performing your way out of it. Managing is different. Managing is pre-editing yourself so the discomfort never arrives. Managing is constructing the version of you that will produce the desired reaction in the other person. Managing is the thing you do when you do not trust the relationship or do not trust yourself enough to let the real thing into the room. One is care, the other is control. And what it controls above everything else is you. You were right to care. You have always been right to care. The only question this video is actually asking is what caring looks like when it is not being filtered through the persona's need to be acceptable. It looks like the honest thing instead of the smooth thing. It looks like the relationship that survives a difficult conversation instead of the one that is preserved by the permanent management of anything difficult. It looks like the person who is actually present with you, not performing for you. The energy you have been giving to managing what everyone thinks of you, that energy was always yours. You did not lose it. You lent it out very early to a system that was never going to give it back voluntarily. Taking it back is not a betrayal of the people who matter. It is the only way you ever actually get to be there for them. Individuation is just that. Turning around. Which layer surprised you most? Write it in the comments. I read them, especially the ones where something uncomfortable arrived.